Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Breaking Into Cybersecurity. And today we're Thursday. I am not Renee. She is our amazing other host. She wasn't able to make it today, so I am filling in. I'm doing my part and her part. So, for those of you following us on LinkedIn, please ensure that you follow myself and both of our amazing guests today. We have Dutch Schwartz and Ian Amit. Both of them have really extensive background in cyber and cloud, and I think that's gonna be the topic for today. Just decided we'll talk about that intersection today, and then for those of you who are on YouTube, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and that notification button. That way you get notified the next time. And for those of you on podcast, don't forget to share with friends and family so that we could get more people interested into cybersecurity. And with that, let's introduce our guests. Dutch, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. I'm a cloud security strategist, so I spend my days and nights with CISOs, CSOs, architects, and so what I focus on personally is really around the title kind of says a cloud security strategy, right? So I really focus on to some degree frameworks, but mostly around culture, strategy, leadership. How do we, sort of the human elements, really to a large degree, right? In some ways, my role is a translator, right, to translate between the business and the technologists. So if I'm doing it well, right, that's part of my role is to really kind of take us from where we've been historically, which is where I would say is a cost center under IT, right? Because of the way we came up historically, to now CISOs or CSOs, if not reporting directly to the CEO and the board, certainly talking directly to the CEO and the board, even if that's not the formal structure. And that change started about 4.5, 5 years ago. But of course, unfortunately, but pointfully here, it accelerated during the pandemic, right? With all those that really kind of condensed everybody's cycles to where they are. So really, a lot of what I do is kind of help executives and architects or aspiring folks, in that area, think about. We've made it to the adult table, as I would call it, from an American standpoint, right? And so that also means that we have to do things that are not just technical, but we have to understand what are my business initiatives? How does the board think about risk? I don't get to set risk appetite and risk tolerance, right? They do. Also, kind of coaching folks that we don't own, I'm going to use air quotes, we don't own risk, right? We are there to inform on risk, advise on risk, mitigate it. We're there to manage it when and if it occurs, but we don't own risk, right? I've seen that as a kind of, again, a historical thing that leads to candidly burnout and people's frustration because they don't feel, it's hard for them to feel like they did a great job today, right? So that's kind of another piece that I focus on, is helping people understand, hey, risk really is a business choice, just like any business choice, whether it be manufacturing or the risk of arbitrage or currency exchange. It's just another type of risk, but it is integral today because most people can't do anything candidly without digital and cybersecurity, right? So it's changed that. So for aspiring folks, I would encourage you, wherever you are in your career, to start talking to your peers outside of IT, outside of security, outside of dev, and start talking to people in HR, in finance, in legal, logistics, so there's other domains, because ultimately we're in service to them.
Well, thank you for that introduction,
You
Dutch.
bet.
Ian, you want to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yes, sir, of course. So Ian Amit, I am a Chief Security Officer, currently acting as an advisory CISO with Rapid7, working with strategic top-tier customers and basically helping them figure out their security programs and enhance them. In my past, I've served as a Chief Security Officer for Cimpress for 4 years, and generally I'm a hacker. I kind of grew up in the hacking community, tinkered a lot, mostly self-taught, and had a long career that spanned everything from low-level kind of Linux hacking and security, pen testing, application security, physical security, red teaming around the world, lots of research and speaking engagements. And at some point, I kind of shifted all the way into the dark side and joined the executive team. And what Dutch said about being a translator and working with the board and managing risk and owning risk at some parts definitely resonated with me.
Okay. And so we try to make this as interactive as possible. So we invite our guests to join in the conversation. So we're going to shout out a couple of our listeners so far. We have Roy, who's saying good morning to everyone, and David saying good evening to everyone. So we have folks from all over the world joining, and that makes it an interesting part of the conversation. So as we think about the evolving threat landscape within the cloud, how does someone new to the industry really pick up the skills needed to be able to jump into, say, a cloud security role and spin up really quickly? Want to go first?
Ian, you want to go first?
Okay. Sure. Yeah, I can. Working with a few security engineers and people who actually shifted from a non-cloud perspective, even kind of a DevOps or pure dev perspective, and wanted to get into cloud security. I was kind of facilitating and helping them throughout that transition and journey. I think that the key area is really, two key areas. One is to relearn the architecture. A lot of people who are coming in from the more traditional approaches of data centers and the old school 3-tier application architectures, really, if they try to force that, if they try to apply those concepts into the cloud, it's a complete failure. So the first step is really to relearn how the cloud works. What are the moving pieces in it? Like, what are the interactions? How can you form what are the rules of the road, so to speak? Which leads to the second concept, which is try it for yourself. It is so cheap these days, borderline free. On every major cloud provider, you can get some free credits and literally just play around. They will pay you almost to take their courses, to learn how to use their specific cloud facilities. And doing that and coming in with a security mindset, it's you're going through the motions of doing all those walkthrough tutorials of deploying applications and securing them and scaling them and providing access and revoking access and all those different things. If you keep in mind kind of the security aspect of it, you're going to do so much learning that's going to really set you up for success as a security professional dealing with cloud security. So having that hands-on experience, not just reading about it, but actually experiencing it, actually connecting things, tearing it down, applying some pen testing, applying some adversarial techniques to it to make sure that it's actually working. Trying out with different roles to see how that applies and how that looks like from a practical perspective, I think goes a long way. From my point of view, at least, I'm going to give much more credit to someone who's gone through that than to someone who's been taking courses or anything kind of almost formal in cloud security, because they have that hands-on, they know how it interacts, and they can later on work with the right people in the organization to get security to where it needs to be.
I love that. Dutch, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so +1. I agree with everything that Ian just said. So I'll take the last piece and then I'll kind of step through in a more, kind of more structured way. But the last piece, from my perspective, right, and Chris, you and I have talked about this in the past, right? There's a difference between knowledge, skills, and competencies. Okay, knowledge is I read a thing, I studied a thing, I may have even been tested on a thing, right? That's knowledge, and that's the base, right? A skill is more narrow. Okay, a skill is I know how to configure this specific, I'll just pick WAF as an example, this specific WAF from this specific vendor to mitigate against the OWASP top 10. That's a good thing. That's a positive thing. However, a competency is a skill which transfers. as an example, to Ian's point, a competency here is the ability to learn on the fly. That competency, you could have had that from working in a charity, working in the federal government, working in a completely different domain. You could be an auditor in insurance. You could be somebody who's in law enforcement. The ability to learn on the fly, I would suggest, is a critical competency that you should look for. And that's because the pace of the cloud is an order of magnitude faster than it was historically, and sort of in all ways, right? And so the good news is you get 3,000 times a day to try a thing. The bad news is you get 3,000 times a day to try a thing, right? So you have to think about that. So where I see people where they might run into obstacles initially trying to make that transition, there's a couple. One is thinking of it as thinking of the cloud, okay, in the biggest term possible here. Thinking of it as someone else's computer was clever. It was a funny t-shirt. I had, it's a great sticker. I get it. I was there. I had one of those, stickers. That's not helpful for most people because it's really not somebody else's computer. It's really not somebody else's data center, in as much as structurally, to Ian's point, it's slightly different, right? The way that APIs work, the way that the management plane works is not the same. And again, I'm being general because it's really similar across. It doesn't really matter which CSP or a provider you're talking about here. So how do you then kind of come to that from a different standpoint or a better starting point? One is you need to understand, and Ian kind of implied this, you need to understand whatever flavor of shared responsibility model that you're going to be working in. That's really critical. You need to go ground yourself in that. And luckily there's tons of people, thousands of people you can go talk to, right? An open community to talk about that. So you need to understand shared responsibility. You understand, how does GRC change? How do policies change when you move into a cloud environment? You need to have if you don't already, you should spend time with devs, with the DevOps environment, because philosophically, that's much closer to where cloud is headed. It is today, depending on your maturity and where you're headed, right? And then automation. Automation is absolutely critical. I kind of touched on that, right? I mean, so back in the old days, like I'm old, right? Like we would do like 2 major releases a year. We have a couple of dot releases. I mean, it is completely astronomically different, right? The pace of that, okay? So to Ian's point, I would say relearn, but you have to rethink how you approach those things, right? The control mechanisms, the things that you would read in CIS or NIST or et cetera, UK Cyber Essentials, those control mechanisms, right? The ideas behind those are the same, right? Because those principles are well understood, but how you implement those may not be the same in a particular cloud environment. And so you really should spend the time. So I +1 Ian on the whole, get your hands on a keyboard. There's tons of opportunities. There's a lot of great training. Chris, you do training. I mean, there's a lot of things that you can do to upskill that, but you do need to think about it in a different way.
Yeah, absolutely. And let me pivot over to some of the comments. We've got some more comments here. Will said, I would love to get paid to learn. And it's true, you do get paid to learn, because I mean, I know, not to mention names, but Azure, AWS, GCP, they all provide credits for you. So you're being paid to learn. You get to use their stuff for free. So definitely take advantage of that, Sean. On the YouTube side, we have good afternoon, wondering if Dutch has any specific tools that they would recommend for a newbie to start with, for example, Splunk, or Ian, no offense. I know we could touch to that in a bit. And then with regards to learning on the fly, yes, Sean, and manufacturing, you can learn on the fly too. David Riaz pointed out, Ian, good point. Also, which cloud services or virtual assets can you get your hands on to make them work and learn? Yeah, let's talk about that. What recommendations might you have for a specific tool set or environment to play around? Ian, you want to go first?
Yeah, and Chris, you already mentioned the big cloud providers already. I mean, right off the bat, you can get free credits and play around with essentially every type of service that they offer, almost every type of service. On top of that, if you want to kind of combine more complex situations, you can do cross cloud. All right, so you can sign up to GCP and to Azure into AWS and test out how it's going to look like. Again, in the real world, you're going to run into that. You're going to run into a mostly AWS environment, but someone in marketing wants to do some analytics on GCP. Creating those back and forth is an amazing opportunity, and also adding third parties. From a DevOps side, if you start looking at the CI/CD kind of pipelines and stacks, all of them have free tiers in them that you can play around, you can construct them, you can break them, you can kind of experience how that works. These are the main ones that I would really focus on. All the major providers have very, very good documentation, have tutorials, have walkthroughs, and kind of pre-planned, build this, build that, like a full stack application. So that's where I would go. It's Chris, again, you mentioned the big three. Definitely my first starting point would be there.
Okay. And Dutch, what about your thoughts?
Yeah, I certainly agree. Certainly for North America, Americas, EMEA customers, right? Those are the three, right? There are obviously some nuances in other areas where there are ones that are slightly more percentage-wise important.
Mm-hmm.
But I would sort of shy away from any specific tool because I don't know without knowing that person's background. But what I would say is look at areas so just to get started, right? So here's an example. For any of the three that were mentioned, you really need to have a great understanding of identity and access management. It's the absolute starting point for a cloud environment relative, and it was not the case necessarily, right, when we were all on-prem. So you might want to really dig deep into identity and access management. You want to spend time, I agree with Ian, on DevOps. So like pick an area, right? So think of a functional area as opposed to a tool. And I'll just take the one you mentioned, Splunk, phenomenal, right? Unbelievable. There's great resources, but Splunk is fairly mature, right, in terms of where and when you would interact with a SIM like that. So I would suggest more basic things like identity access management, policies, right? It's really important to get policies, correct. Understanding DevOps, to your point, right? The CI/CD pipe. How do you do secure CI/CD, or different terminology? But and then Ian, you mentioned the multiple cloud opportunities, and I think there's validity to that. Also, just from a pure learning standpoint, right? Every environment will use slightly different language that essentially means the same thing, right? We're back to translating. And so if that's something that's interesting to you, begin that early in your career. Hey, how would I do this, with person A? How would I do it with B? How would I do it with C? Because doing that will help you. And then the last piece of that I would say is once you get some experience, teaching somebody else will be the best way for you to learn. It'll push you, right? There's sometimes a hesitation, because we use these terms like subject matter expert, which I'm not a fan of, but we get called those sometimes, and I understand the philosophy behind why they say that, but sometimes it's inhibiting, right? So if you're new to an area, you feel like, oh, I can't. Like Chris might be like, oh, I can't say anything on this topic because I'm not an expert. Like there's very few experts. There's just such a wide range of things that you can do in a cloud security environment. So don't let that inhibit you, right? You still have a point of view. If you've learned something cool, great. There's somebody who's not learned that yet. And maybe they're super experienced or mature in another area. That's awesome. But teaching somebody else will really fundamentally help you understand the thing that you're trying to improve upon.
I cannot agree more, by the way, Dutch, about that teaching experience. It forces you into a perspective of, pardon my French, but oh shit, now I'm responsible for teaching someone else. I have to make sure that I don't just know that specific topic, but I have to know a little bit more left and right, just to make sure that, whatever question comes up, I can feel that. And it forces you to have so much better learning yourself. And I can attest to that. Sometimes I've been teaching, I've been doing courses. It puts you in a situation where you get so much better at what you do and so much closer to that expert status. So, huge plus one on that. That is, and I'm being challenged all the time, even in new things that I'm learning. My teachers at some point will tell me, all right, now you teach me. You're at the point where I want you to think about how to translate your learnings back into like teaching someone new. And that is a huge, huge step forward.
Yeah, and I think what I hear you saying, Ian, and this is kind of a good backdrop too, is context. context is really important, right? So again, when you are a 10,000 hours theory person, right? So it's a great theory. There's a lot of efficacy to that. And there's certain domains where that's really useful. But I would also encourage you to pick up a book called Range, which teaches you that you can make a mid-career change. You can come from another discipline, right? And James is not here to argue with me, but I would suggest that there's a lot of value, right? We should have organizational psychologists. We should have social historians. We should have other domains, because there are things that we're learning or we're relearning in cybersecurity that have been well understood for decades in other areas that we can apply. So context is really useful. That ability, what Ian said, was to abstract something. Because when you teach, if I have to teach Chris, I have to rethink this. I have to abstract. Well, it's not about just this specific line of code or this command. It's, well, why am I using that one versus another one? And what does that mean? And where does that lead to? So the ability to translate and the ability to put things into context will really accelerate, whatever your career path is.
Wow. So I have a question for both of you. We often think about the shared responsibility model in the cloud, and we know the two things that we're always responsible for is our data and the identity within the cloud. So when it comes to those two things, how mature do we feel organizations are, say, for example, in tracking data lineages and protecting their information in the cloud? And then on the other aspect of it, managing access at an identity level to data and who in an organization should have access.
Ian wants to take that one. I'll take that one. I guess so. It's a huge range. I mean, that's my honest answer, right? I mean, so it's a very different if the three of us were not in cybersecurity and we left tomorrow and we started a bicycle company. We might never really need to learn cybersecurity or frankly IT, right? Because now we have native so we might start native, right? And that's a very different maturity path for, I'm a 80-year-old company. And I don't like the word tech debt because it's by definition really negative the way, but what you have is inertia, right? You have inertia. And it was built probably with good intentions. In other words, you have training, you have workflow, you have knowledge, you have a whole host of things that just happen by nature from a timeline standpoint. And so I think that's a huge range, Chris, to answer your question, but you pointed out those are the things, right? So in the military, we talk about, I can delegate my authority, but I can't delegate my responsibility. I can't. Okay. It's just kind of a pinnacle hallmark of the way that military leadership thinks, right? It's the same thing here. You can delegate opportunities to create policies, but and I say you, I mean the business always owns their risk. It has to be that way because that's the nature of the business, right? Is to be able to make choices on that risk, right? And they get to make those trade-offs, right? It's our job to inform them, about those choices, to talk about a particular risk posture or maybe trends or changes that are happening. But at the end of the day, if we do, in my estimation, if we do our roles correctly, it's to thoughtfully advise on risk using language that the business understands, right? And then once to your earlier point, you have a part of the business that wants to use a particular piece of software, a particular tooling, and you've advised, hey, we don't really have the expertise and we don't have the workflow, et cetera, et cetera. At some point, the business gets to make that choice, right? If they're the leader, they own the P&L, they're the CEO, they get to make that choice. And then we have to flip into support mode and say, okay, now that this risk, this is a risk that's being accepted. Now, how do we mitigate that to the best of our ability? And then resiliency is critical. So if something were to happen, let's tabletop that. Let's role play it. Like, what would we do then if something were to happen? So that's kind of how I think about that. It's a huge range, and you need to understand, where's my business? Because your business might choose to move very quickly, right? Knowing that there will be some trade-offs. And it's as long as you've explained those in a way that they understand, then we've done our part, right? And then we have to go into resource protection, response mode.
What are your thoughts on that, Ian?
So from my perspective, first of all, it's a super challenging question and very, very broad. That shared responsibility model, again, as an ex-Amazonian, I can absolutely connect to it and relate to it. And every business needs to understand that they cannot just kind of shop around for risk. They cannot just shop around for a solution and expect everything to be just unicorns and rainbows and roses. They have a responsibility for executing. We talked before about skills and practices and kind of, taking the tools and doing something with them. That's their responsibility. And having said that, the complexity that modern cloud environments yield in terms of data, in terms of identities, is nowhere where it was 10, 15 years ago. So that poses a whole new challenge, and that shared responsibility model becomes much more challenging for businesses that are getting into the cloud or starting to adopt it. Again, going back to my previous comment about those transitioning into the cloud, those taking more of the traditional architectural aspects and trying to adapt into the cloud. These are typically the situations where you see a lot of failures, where you see a lot of learnings, all right, not failures, in terms of, what do I do with all that data and identities? Like that mesh of access controls and interactions between things gets very, very complicated, and people make a lot of mistakes around it. So 2 things from my end. Again, one is learn that environment. All right, these are fresh new skills. You have to understand how that works. All the cloud providers, all the major suppliers do have native tools that will audit your own data permissions and access permissions and identity structure. Having said that, they might not be the super friendliest tools in the world. And that kind of created a whole new market for third-party tools, which we all know and love, that are there to accommodate for that, let's call it gap in terms of skill set. So if you have engineers that are not, weren't born into the cloud, are not like super well versed in it, then from the business perspective, that's a good opportunity to understand, where do I want to invest now? Do I want to invest in more skill sets so that my people can know how to operate those basic tools and kind of chart out that identity and data path mapping? Or do I invest it in third-party tools that are going to do that for me and free up my people to do something else? So again, it goes back to the business. The concept stays the same. It is your responsibility. You're using the tools, you're putting data there, you're configuring identities. It's up to you. No one's going to, kind of walk you through, because no one knows your business better than you are. So it's your responsibility, and then it's just a question of, do I apply my own skill sets, or do I acquire my own skill sets to do that properly, or do I take it outside in forms of consulting or third parties that are providing tools that will kind of snap onto those cloud environments and help me figure out, back to Dutch's point, help me figure out what is the context, what does that mean? Where is the top risk? And top risk means, you've got an asset that seems to be critical, that has a lot of access potential. Maybe not first level, kind of everything is open, but you've got a lot of identities around it. A lot of roles can be assumed around that, and there's just a mesh, as I said, of interconnections that would allow an attacker to more easily traverse it and get into that asset. So that's where the tools, what those third-party tools are there for. That's how some of those cloud native tools also work in terms of charting path on kind of that connectivity graph to show you what's accessible and what's not. And it is back to the business. It's their responsibility in that shared responsibility model.
Wow. I absolutely love that. We have some great comments as well coming in. Will said, super insightful stuff already, guys. Example, risk management versus risk ownership, cloud versus on-prem, and everything that you need to learn. Of course, the comment that James isn't here to grumble about liberal arts degrees. And then
Ian, for your sake, my bachelor's is in history. So James and I go around and around, on that my
I'm not going to hold it against you. That's fine.
Yeah.
And then one for you, Ian. Love the recommendation for the Range book. Any chance Ian has a favorite hacker theme book that he wanted to recommend?
Oh, wow. Hacker books. I'm actually going to go with a classic that I've kind of revisited fairly recently, which is The Cuckoo's Egg. Always applicable, an
Yeah.
amazing story. And I've only recently was exposed to a Nova documentary that was done with the actual kind of, heroes, so to speak. So Cliff Stalls plays himself in that documentary. It kind of walks through, what it was like. And although Cliff himself doesn't, isn't considered a hacker, it's one of the classic kind of hacker books that I've read early in my career, in my academic career. So I love getting back to that book and kind of rereading it. There's a lot of others, but I would actually go old school and reread that, because it really talks about the mentality and the challenges. And a lot of that old school stuff can still be applied today. It might not be a dot matrix printer that you're using. It might be something else to kind of track the logs and get those and archive those logs and go through them. But it still applies, and I think it's a great story.
Absolutely, and that's the Cuckoo's Egg, right? Yeah. Scott asked for the name again. I would say for my book, it is Project Phoenix. And while it's not directly applicable, I mean, you could see, I see myself in a lot of the characters. And then you have the follow-on Project Unicorn or Unicorn Project. I mix it up all the time. And I definitely agree. Like those two books, especially Unicorn Project, that's totally DevOps, totally cloud, totally today. So those are your recommendations, Scott. Will mentioned, yep, Cuckoo's Egg is a must-read. Cliff Stall is a legend. He even personally replied to an email that I sent when I first got into InfoSec. Wow, that's amazing there, Will. So the next question that I have for both of you actually is, as the threat of like these malicious ransomwares that are becoming easier and easier to deploy, what are some of the strategies that you would recommend for an individual, a company, to better prepare themselves?
I'm going to give you a very just blunt and transparent and very simple answer. The things that you need to do to protect yourself don't really change based on the manner in which the threat presents itself to you. So I get asked this question. Of course, it was very trendy and timely for obvious reasons. And my answer is still the same. You really, and if you could step out and talk about music or sports or another area, right? The fundamentals are critical. And I know they don't always excite and jazz everybody up, especially when you're 7, 9, 12 years into your career. But my analogy or example that I would give, and it's just a simple one, because I was at a thing where Peyton Manning was speaking. He did a great job. I'm not like a Colts or Peyton Manning fan per se, but he did a really great job. And one of the things that really always stayed with me all these years later was every summer he would go back to his college and practice his footwork every summer. And again, you could pick somebody else. You can pick Michael Jordan, you pick Kobe Bryant, you pick LeBron James. Again, I'm using sports, but you can go through music or other activities. You have to do the basics. You have to, and that's one of the things that people who become really knowledgeable about a thing, they go back to the basics over and over and over again. And they try to learn it a different way. They try to understand, how does Ian do it versus the way I do it. So I love that there's some kind of magic potion or different answer. The answer is you have to do identity correctly. You have to understand, what am I trying to protect? You have to understand what risks of the business it's willing to take, and how do we respond to that? And then resilience is absolutely critical, right? We went through these throes where we're like, no, we'll never be breached. And then we finally said, okay, that's true. It's just really not, because mentally it's not helpful, right? It doesn't help people to think about it that way. And I get, if you're talking to a business executive, you may have to coach them, right? And again, analogies, we learn through stories, right? Analogies will help people, right? So occasionally, again, because it's a physical cue, I've taken like an old school light switch and a rheostat. And I'm like, I think that you think that security is like this. It's binary, right? It's off and it's on. And I told a little story about how light switches are invented to make it kind of stick with them. And I'm like, what it's really like is this rheostat. Okay. All right. And as things change, we have to change with it. And so there's things that you can do to help the business folks understand, but it's not binary. There's no end to the way that we secure things, right? So the things that I would suggest you do to protect yourself from ransomware are the exact same things I would say to protect yourself from crypto mining or anything, right? It is the basic fundamental things. You have to nail those. That is, in my view, the path to success.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, if I'm trying to provide kind of a 1, 2, 3 best practices, I would start with, because the question was individually and then from a business. Individually, again, it's the basics that Dutch talked about. Practically, what it means: backups. All right, back it up on the cloud. Most of it, again, a lot of it can be free. I would actually opt for paying a little more, like $100 a year or something like that. Gives you the ability to also restore to a particular point or to have versioning in your backups and have some local backup. Basic practices, we've been doing that forever. MFA, in every opportunity, every account that you have, back to Dutch's point about identity, it's a basic element that anyone can do on their Gmail account, on their Facebook, on their LinkedIn, on every SaaS application, almost to a point where you log into your personal computer, you can have some form of additional authentication that is going to highly reduce the attack surface of an attacker. And then going into kind of the more business perspective, I'm going to harp into that attack surface, all right, or the ability for a ransomware element to spread across the network, because we're going from an individual to a network of computers. In that sense, it becomes a little more complicated, but the same concepts apply. Again, remove the data, separate it as far away from the local asset as possible. Don't have people work on local files, have them work on cloud files or centralized storage, and back that up. All right, it's much easier than to try to back up 10,000 machines. If you have everything stored in one place, and you can have a really truly resilient backup scheme, and resiliency there can show up in the forms of, it's very easy for me to dispose of your machine and get you a new one. VDIs, disposable, like secure browsers, whatever it is. What you're doing is essentially reducing the attack surface, and if something does get hit, it cannot. So you're minimizing the lateral movement. You're making it harder for an attacker to traverse your network because you have MFAs, you have more restrictive access controls. And in the event that an outbreak will occur, it's going to be much more localized and much more containable. So you're essentially buying yourself time to deal with that, minimizing the impact, restoring very quickly. And the bottom line is that the business stays up. And that's what you're trying to accomplish here.
And now, as we move to the next step of that, how do we recover? I mean, I know you mentioned having backups, but one of the things that I've seen is that people never test their backups. They never validate that it works properly. And then there's the other thing where the backups might be 2, 3 versions out of date. And then now when you restore it, it doesn't function properly. What are some of the ways that you might recommend that businesses opt to prepare for that?
Yeah, right. You play like you practice. It's just really that simple. So again, whatever story or whatever will grip, but you have to tell a human story that people will connect with, right? And so if that one works, and works for your audience, use that. But you absolutely have to practice that, right? I mean, so you should have periodic, and it doesn't matter if it's quarterly or I can't tell you the right frequency depending on that business or the criticality of that asset, right? But you have to test it. I mean, it's just really that simple, right? So I said tabletops because that's a workflow and a people discussion, right? But the underpinnings of that are you have to actually have at a technical, tactical level, the people who are actually the admins, they have to practice that. And so you have to block off the time, and it has to be a critical gating factor, or else to Chris, to your point, you don't know what your risk is, right? So then the resiliency, I mean, if you and I'm saying resiliency. If there's another word again that resonates inside of your culture, use that word. But you have to be able to recover in a way that is as graceful as you possibly can. And how graceful that is completely dependent on the risk that you're willing to take. And I would point out there's more than one category of risk. And as a cybersecurity practitioner, you should understand it. So I'll take myself and interaction as an example, right? We often think, to your point, Chris, about data. We think about PII. We think about, sort of specific discrete pieces of data. And more than one time in my career, I've asked a CIO, CTO, CISO, hey, what's the most, I don't want to presume, I think I know, but like, what's the most critical thing for you? And there are many times where it was not what I thought it was, as somebody who's external, like consulting and helping them. And as an example, to give you the category, so you have business or operational risk. That's like what we normally think about, right? Then there's the threat of litigation, and there's the threat of reputation or reputational risk. And that's an example. So there might be instances where if there's been something that's happened in that environment, for the board, for your chief legal counsel, and for your CFO, the threat of litigation might be much more impactful, right, than a business operational risk. So you need to also understand and tune your, so if that's a higher concern, then that needs to be tested more frequently, whatever the downstream impacts of that are. If it's business or if it's reputational, then you need to orient on this. But you've got to have a way to orient, because you cannot do all things, right? That's I know we say it a lot, but it's still true, right? It's the Alexander the Great thing, he who defends everything defends nothing, right? We cannot do all of the things perfectly. We just can't. So you've got to have a way to focus, and the focus can't be about, in my estimation, a vol matrix, something like discrete and tactical that we use. It needs to be aligned to, where does the business see that risk? That's where then I have to lean into in terms of frequency, testing, resiliency. That's how I would orient.
Okay. And Ian, how would you orient
one simple point from my end? I'm going to be very blunt here. If you haven't tested for real your controls, you did nothing. Absolutely zero. And you can spend all the money in the world on the fanciest cyber products, blinking lights, brand names, and hashtags and whatever it is. If you haven't tested it for real, like a full backup, full restore to a working condition where people can actually operate the business, you did absolutely nothing. And I think a lot of people fail in that. Now, again, I'm being very, very blunt here, because people are lazy, and they buy something, they get a lot of fancy services around it and customer support and all that jazz, but they forget to actually put it to the test. That is the key for me. How to test it, that's a different question. Again, you can do the classic, all right, let's just do a functional test. Let's do a full, like after a backup or after a period where things have been running correctly, let's take down a machine, let's make some data disappear, and then do a full restore to a working condition. You're fully safe, nothing can be broken, that's fine, and you can actually test that process. Another form of testing, my favorite one, is kind of relates a little more to what Dutch says about more risk-oriented one, is do a proper red team. Hire someone to understand how your business works, to actually simulate an attacker, no bars held, that is going to go right after your core assets. That's going to find the easiest way to get there, not the fastest, not the most obvious one, not the one that you've spent all the money in the world to protect, but the easiest. And that might traverse some social engineering and physical and cyber and whatever it is. Get there and experience how it's really like to be attacked. I love it. I love it because in a proper red team, everyone gets the experience. There's only a handful of people in the organization that actually know that this is a red team, and everyone else runs as if this is an actual event. You'll be the most hated person in the company for about a week and a half. I think that's the running average. But after that, everyone goes like, oh, you know what, that was great, because we haven't gone through like a full-on attack experience in a while. And beyond the tabletops, it really got us back onto our toes. It really kind of got the rust off of some of the muscle memory that you used to have. And it really shows you whether you're focusing on the right areas of risk or not. And it gets you to go through that functional testing as well of a restoration or resilience.
I love it. I love it. One of the comments coming in, David says, I say it all the time. It's not buying the latest and greatest. It's investing into what we need and then testing to make sure it works. Hire a third party to come and show the weakness. Ian, you touched on one of the things that gets confused a lot, the difference between a red team and a pen test. Would you like to share the differences for our audience? Because I think that, like, having someone come in and do a red team or do a red team from the inside, however you do it, that's different than a pen test. Because
Correct.
And I'd love to hear your insights on the differences between them.
So the difference from my perspective is pretty simple. A penetration test is a scoped engagement that focuses on a set of assets and provides you the assurance that each and every one of those scoped assets is being functionally tested for vulnerabilities, for a potential exploitations, for lateral movement, for a predefined set of attack scenarios that a typical attacker would have in their tool set. A red team, and again, because it has a scope, it is limited by nature, because that scope limits your exposure to additional risk. And it gives you, as I said, assurance that each and every one of those assets are going to be tested. And you're going to get a pretty good picture of what's going on there. A red team, on the other hand, is a full adversarial simulation. It is conducted typically by a third party or by a dedicated team that is tasked with, first and foremost, understanding what is the threat actor. Okay, I can simulate a random attacker in their parents' basement. I can simulate a competitor with a different skill set and motivation and access. I can simulate an insider. I can simulate a nation state. All right, these are all completely different attack scenarios or threat actors. So first of all, threat actors. Second of all, understanding the business. Again, an attacker would have a goal. A nation state might just want to shut you down, because they're going to achieve some reputation. A competitor might want to steal your intellectual property and keep you running, or manipulate with your running processes so that they're more successful in the market. So each one of those scenarios or target assets is going to look differently. And then the execution itself, as opposed to a pen test, red team does not have a scope. If you start scoping out and limiting what a red teamer can do, you're basically going back to a pen test, because you cannot limit an actual attacker with what you're allowed and what you're not allowed. What times can you operate? Who can you talk to? Can you create fake companies and get into my supply chain? Can you talk to my people? Can you walk into my building? If there's any kind of limitation like that, you're talking about pen test, because a red team, a true attacker, would utilize all those things. Create social media, fake social media accounts, infiltrate into your company, be an insider, get hired, get physical, social engineer your executives or your so again, back to supply chain, your cleaners, your third parties, utilize them to get into your company. That's how a red team operates. And the last difference is typically a pen test is conducted over, a week, a couple of weeks, 3 weeks tops. A good red team has a minimal time frame of at least a month, in which they operate freely. They can go slow. They can kind of poke around. They're really much less obvious than a pen test. And in a red team, you're actually testing your defenses, not just the controls, not just the technical controls that are going to show up in a pen test, but your defenses, your ability to do proper analytics in your XDR or SIM, your ability to operationalize your SOC or MDR in terms of understanding. There's kind of a threat brewing up here. There is a anomaly in terms of someone's behavior. We're seeing something funky. We're starting to see some lateral movement. All of those things are really being stressed out in a red team as opposed to a pen test that's just not going to get there.
Yeah, I mean, what I would add to Ian's experience there is, let's go back to where the word comes from, right? I mean, so Red Cell, right, is SEAL Team 6, Dick Marchenko, okay? And so if you haven't read that book, it's there's some hyperbole and it's kind of bombastic, so I will say that at the front end, but the factual pieces of it are very accurate. So as a former military officer, like we have the formal, what we call opposing forces, right? We study the doctrine, what we think we're going to come up against, and that's useful. That's much more like a pen test. I can assure you, is way more fun to be a red team person in the military, where I would just get to jump in, drop in, do whatever with a small group of people and cause complete havoc, right? Because only the commander, requests that and knows it's going to happen, and that is a lot more fun. And it exposes a lot more different things, because I could do social engineering. I could pretend to be other people, and then you kind of give them a wake up call, right? So we used to leave like the ace of spades, next to the sleeping people. So they wake up and this is what we could have done had we have wanted to, right? The formal people that you thought you were fighting, guess what? The enemy gets a vote. The enemy gets a vote too. And the enemy's not going to play it out the way that you want to. It's still useful because it's practice, right? That's like pen testing. But to Ian's point, if you want to see the history of kind of where that terminology comes from, it's Red Cell, it's SEAL Team 6 from Dick Marchenko.
Okay. Well, let's kind of take a pivot in the conversation. We're approaching the last 10 minutes, and I want to think about the future. Think about the future of cybersecurity professionals. How do we create a pipeline of individuals to solve tomorrow's problems? I know it's wide and vast and hard, but everyone has their own view.
So I'll go since I'm on screen. So I think that we need to rethink how we bring people in, how we move people laterally from other parts of our company, and how we upskill. Because those, to me, are the sort of the three paths, right? So let's talk about each one of those. Bringing people in, obviously, that's the theme of this, right? Breaking into cybersecurity. Just the fact that we have to say breaking in is a problem, right? We have a problem here, right? We're not viewed as being accepting of people who have not less skills, not less opportunity, but they're at the earlier part of their career, right? So why is that? Well, I would suggest that 20 years ago, there were a lot of internship programs. There were a lot of technology programs. There was ways to get into a company, and many big companies, whether they were in the government contractor space or just Fortune 500 companies, had those kind of programs. And candidly, a lot of us learned that way. We came up through that. Well, what happened? Well, when the dot-com bubble burst, a lot of that training, a lot of those internships, et cetera, those were one of the first things to go away, right? And then through the second financial crisis, right, that was more broad, the same thing, right? So I think that you have to step back and say, if we're going to solve this, which is a systemic, long-term problem that we're going to have, we have to rethink that. So what will you do? Well, you have to double down on your investment then, right? You have to be willing to bring people in, right? I can, Ian can teach you, Chris can teach you. We can teach you cybersecurity. We can teach you how to code. We can teach you how to do CI/CD. We can teach you all those things, right? What I would hire for is aptitudes and competencies, right? I'm looking for those things because we can teach you. But if you're in a manager, director, if you're in a senior position, then you have to invest and plan for how you're going to train and give these people opportunities to learn. You can't just say, okay, great, well, we got them in here and good luck to you, right? Because then you're going to get a random distribution of how people will perform, right? That's not how you train large groups of people. You cannot do it that way. So you have to have training, right? It's the same thing. If you have people in your company today and they want to move into cybersecurity, you should take them. If they already understand your company, they know your culture by they're de facto good employees, you should take them. But we need more programs so people can move from HR, from legal, frankly, from marketing, from sales, from logistics, from transportation, whatever that is. If they're already in your company, bring them over. But you have to have a program of how you're going to train them, right? And then the upskilling, I'll talk about, you need to be able to rotate through different aspects of the roles, right? And you guys both touched on this, right? You can absolutely make a great living and feel very fulfilled by doing one thing really, really well. That is the path. I'm not suggesting that is not a great path, but because of the rapidness of the change, I would suggest thinking about rotating through different things. And again, you should create a program for that, right? So Ian spends a couple weeks doing GRC, then he spends a couple weeks doing right? And again, they're not because they'll become then your lead person in that area, but they will do better over time if you help them understand there's pen testing, there's GRC, there's red teaming, there's blue teaming. I mean, and go through the different areas, right? So those are the three things of how do you bring people in from outside? How do you move people laterally that are already at your company? And then how do you upskill the people that you have? Because you've got to do that because they know there's opportunities, right? There's a negative percentage in terms of your the hiring, right? We're in a deficit, right? So you've got to give them opportunities to be engaged. Why are we doing this thing that we're doing, right? What are my opportunities to learn? What are my opportunities to develop? So that's how I see some approaches that we could take.
Appreciate it, Dutch. Ian, just before you start, a couple comments. Love this conversation, shared insight, definitely having to listen to this again. Love the takeaways. And then Scott says, that's it. I'm changing all my plans, completely sold. I'm going on a red team. Fantastic webinar. Most informative Thursday in a while. Really great stuff. So thank you there, everyone, for listening. And Ian, what are your views on creating the future of cybersecurity?
Not a lot to add to what Dutch said. I fully agree. Maybe just a couple of emphasis. One is don't look at the obvious places. That lateral movement. That look for people. I typically hire, honestly, based on kind of a twinkle in their eye when they talk about cybersecurity in general. That twinkle carries a lot with it. It carries passion. It carries the ability to learn new things, and they typically show it. Which leads to that second focus where Dutch talked about upscaling and providing that. From a practical perspective, in a corporate environment, you need to have very specific leveling. So everyone is very, very clear about where they're at and what it would take to get to that next level. I think that we're missing out on a lot of that because it might not be like super PC or super correct to start kind of evaluating and scoring people on a ranking scale. But you know what? That's called a profession, and to get to a professional level, you have to go through several stages, and to do that properly and to get the right training at the right time, you have to be honest, and someone needs to keep you honest about where you're at. I see a lot of people getting hired for a position that is way out of their actual skills and capabilities. And that's a bad experience for the individual and for the company. The company's not getting what they paid for. The individual is getting super frustrated and is getting into that kind of black mire of, oh, I'm not performing, and how do I fake it until I make it? It's just not good for anyone. Have very clear leveling, have an honest discussion and testing and evaluations on where you're at. And that is going to be a great tool to facilitate for the managers in terms of, all right, what's the next level for you? How do we apply the right level of training? Is it me that's going to mentor you? Is it someone else? Do I, send you to some third-party training? All those things, super important, and provide you with the measurable ability to kind of traverse that ladder and get better and get, fill in those positions that were so, finding it so hard to fill these days.
Wow. What a way to wrap up the session. Dutch, Ian, thank you both so much. Everyone, thank you for joining us on CISO Thursdays. And if you're following us on LinkedIn, make sure you follow myself, Dutch, and Ian. And for those of you on YouTube, make sure you hit that subscribe button and the notification button. And for those listening after the fact on podcast, give us a 5-star rating wherever you're listening to us and share us with other folks. Really appreciate it. Everyone, thank you so much for joining us. Have a great